My husband had an accident. Nothing has been the same since.
DisastrousInvolvedI.
Disclaimer: the content presented in this video is purely fictional and intended for entertainment purposes only. I woke to the sound of knocking at the door of the apartment I shared with my partner. It was a little late for visitors or neighbors to be coming by to borrow something, I mused. I slipped out of bed and exited the room. 1 minute. I called out, my voice still thick with sleep. I made my way to the front door where I was greeted by 2 grim-faced uniformed police officers. Mr. Watkins? The one to my right-hand side asked. Yes, may I help you? I asked, are you married to a? He paused to check the notes on a small pad of paper. Terrence Watkins. He prodded further. I am. What is this about? I countered, already slightly defensive and on edge due to the circumstances. I wondered if my usually mild-mannered husband had gotten in trouble. We're sorry to inform you that your husband has been in an accident. The officer who had been silent stepped into the conversation. I felt as if someone had hit me in the chest with a sledgehammer. I couldn't breathe, or make a sound, but silent tears streamed from my eyes. The first officer who had spoke up caught me when my knees buckled and they entered the house, helping me to a seat in the small living room. I managed to calm down enough to talk again. Is he alive? The question was shaky, but clear. He is alive. You don't seem to be in the condition to drive, so we can give you a ride to the hospital if you like. The quieter police officer said. I nodded my head and then hurried back into the bedroom where I quickly changed my clothes and put on socks and shoes. They escorted me to the cruiser and let me into the back seat. For a moment, I felt as if I were in trouble, that being the first time I had ever been in the back of a police car. When we arrived at the large building, they let me out, following me inside. One of the officers went and talked to the receptionist for me. The men in uniform stayed behind when I walked toward the elevator. The ride up to the intensive care unit seemed to take an hour. When the doors finally rolled open, I stepped out, finding my way to the appropriate room. And when I stepped through the open doorway, I froze. My husband was lying on his back with so many wires, hoses and tubes snaking away from his body in various directions that I failed to process what I was seeing for a moment. I moved to his bedside, and reached out, taking the hand of my partner. I don't know if you can hear me, but I am here, baby. I said. There was no response, not even a squeeze of my fingers. I had hoped that his situation wasn't as bad as it looked. My heart sank when the nurse and doctor entered the room and confirmed all of my worst fears. Terry was in a coma, completely brain dead. How long can we keep him on life support? I remember asking. A few months. There's always hope that he will wake up. The best thing to can do is to be here and talk to him when you can. Tonight, you need to go home and get some rest. The doctor informed me. The nurse even called me a cab, and I tried to sleep, but kept waking every few hours, convinced I had heard my phone ring. There were no notifications when I checked, however. I called my boss the next morning and informed him I wouldn't be in for at least a couple of days. Thankfully, he was sympathetic to my situation and told me to take as much time as I needed. I took a shower and shaved, making myself at least look like I had my shit together before I went to the hospital and sat with my husband. Both of our parents visited, and there was prayer and tears among them. I remember sitting in the chapel with them, but I couldn't bring myself to join the prayers. Days passed in similar fashion. When I was not at work, I was in that room with the man I loved. I was starting to lose hope after almost a month, and finally entered the chapel alone, and I sat in front of the altar, sobbing, finally breaking down in prayer. A few days came and went after that, and then one morning I stepped into the room to find Terry's eyes open. I freaked out, screaming for the doctor. The staff rushed in to see what had stirred me up, and I was quickly ushered out of the room. The doctor joined me in the hallway. Your husband is alert and responsive, but I have to caution you that he was unconscious for a long time, and we have seen cases where things like this can lead to wild personality shifts. He said, using a gentle, professional tone. I nodded, but wasn't really absorbing what the man had said. I was just happy that the other man was awake. Some of my joy was dampened by the fact that he was having trouble remembering words and names of common objects. I was grateful, however, that he seemed to remember me, holding my hand and squeezing it affectionately when it was offered. The initial few weeks after his awakening went by slowly while he learned to walk and eat again. The trouble started in the days after he came home. Terry couldn't sleep. I had similar problems in the hospital, but eventually they would give me something to help me. He confessed during a long conversation that led to a protracted argument, and I went to bed angry. We didn't really speak for a few days, and one day, about 2 days after the fight, I came home to an empty apartment. I tried not to worry about it, though I looked for a note and didn't find one. I wasn't surprised then, when Terry came home in the middle of the night. I was, however, startled to hear another voice. This one female. Are you sure that he won't wake up? The strange woman asked just as I had cracked the door. He sleeps harder than most humans. We will not be discovered. Terry replied. I considered bursting that bubble, but something told me to wait. I did open the door slightly wider, but the woman began to turn in my direction and I stopped doing everything, including breathing. After a half a minute I stepped backward. We should go somewhere else. I know somewhere. The woman said, loud enough for me to hear through the partially cracked door. They did leave shortly after that, and I considered following them but thought better of it. I cried myself back to sleep instead. I wondered if this was what the doctor had tried to warn me about the next morning as I shared a silent meal with the man I had married. I desperately tried to think of something to say, but couldn't. He made no effort to start a conversation either. I swallowed the urge to ask about his visitor the night before, and instead got ready to go to work. When I got home, the apartment was vacant again. My husband had left his clothing and other items, so I assumed he would be home late once again. I did wake when the door opened and closed, but didn't get up this time. Days like this turned to weeks. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I turned on the location sharing on my lover's phone, and I even left work early in order to get extra sleep. I heard Terrence enter the apartment with the strange woman again. They stayed only a short time, and this time when they left, I slipped from my bed, and out the door behind them. I used my phone to track them, driving slowly until they stopped in the middle of nowhere. I sped up when I got past the traffic lights and stop signs, only slowing when the GPS prompted me to turn off of the pavement onto a narrow dirt lane. I stopped at the side of this small road as I got near my husband's location, and proceeded on foot, afraid of alerting him and his companion to my presence. I had suspected he was cheating on me, but when I rounded the corner, that no longer made sense. The only structure in the area was a large, old barn. I glanced around and saw Terry's car parked to a small minivan. I glanced around, but it didn't seem anyone was outside. I hurried toward the building, and as I did, noticed strange, flickering lights through the gaps under the doors. I could also hear people chanting inside. I crept to a small door to the left-hand side of the building, the barrier partially cracked, allowing me to peer inside. I didn't see Terry, but I could see the back of his new friend's head. It was bowed as if in prayer. I reached out and gently pried the door open a little further, poking my head inside to see a group of people standing in a circle, a candle at each of their feet. Terry was in the middle, his torso bare, skin smeared and marked with dark ash. He seemed to be leading the chants. I don't know if the cry I felt escaped or I simply gasped. But the woman, who was directly in front of me, spun in a rapid about-face maneuver. I bolted, sprinting back to my car. I went straight home, expecting them to follow behind me. They didn't. I didn't see the man I had married for 2 whole days. When he did return, neither of us mentioned the incident a few nights before. Honestly, I didn't even know if they investigated, or knew that I had seen them. I didn't really want to find out. A week later, he moved out, but still hasn't asked for a divorce. That's where we still stand at the moment. Separated. I haven't seen Terry in 2 months. I will update if anything changes. My husband was in an accident. Nothing has been the same since. Part 2. I made a post about a while ago about my husband. I had been trying to mind my own business. I had never violated Terry's privacy before that night, or since. I still don't know what to think about what I saw in that barn. We have talked for the first time in months. Maybe being away from me on Thanksgiving finally gave him a wake-up call, because he called me. When we met he didn't mention the night I had followed him, so I started to suspect he didn't know it had happened. I wasn't going to be the one to bring it up, I was just happy to have him home, even if it only lasted an hour, and we barely talked. When he left, I checked to see if he had disabled location sharing on his phone. He hadn't. I considered snooping, but managed to restrain myself. I tried to focus on Christmas shopping online, but the urge to pry into my husband's recent activities overwhelmed me. He had been visiting that strange barn at the edge of town a lot lately. I had flashbacks of that night. The strangers surrounding my lover, with those candles at their feet, speaking those strange words. I tried to push it out of my mind. Eventually I managed to focus on my work, and tried to return to normal. I was well on my way to that, even though I have started drinking at night to help me sleep and, if I'm honest, cope with the loneliness I have felt over the last few months. I want my husband back. But I don't know how to go about achieving that goal. I called him the other day, but the conversation was brief. One positive is that we were cordial. He's actually starting to act more like himself again. Maybe all of this is his way of processing his time in the coma. I planned to ask him about that the next time we met up, and I finally worked up the nerve to call him for the second time in a week. I arranged for us to meet on Sunday. The next couple of days seemed to crawl, and grow progressively more lonely as I eagerly anticipated my opportunity to get some answers. Sunday arrived, and I was chipper as I made a pot of coffee and even a small breakfast for myself. I didn't realize how hungry I was. Devouring the waffles quickly, I ventured into the bathroom, and quickly noticed that I had also been neglecting my appearance. I shaved and hurried out of the apartment, driving myself downtown to get a haircut as well. I went and visited my mother, who has been supporting me, though I didn't tell her about the strange ritual in the barn. We talked for a long time, and she echoed a sentiment that I recalled from a comment on my original post. It was time to get my husband back, though I didn't know exactly how to go about it. I went home and got ready to meet Terry. Changing my clothes, I called my husband to confirm that he still wanted to see me, and he said he did, and even suggested a restaurant that we frequented in the early days of our relationship. That gave me hope, and I was actually smiling when I got into the car, already planning on things to say. My spirits died when I saw Terry waiting for me at the doors to the building with an official-looking envelope. "Don't open this until we get inside, please," he said, and I felt my face fall into a frown. "What's going on, Terrence?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He simply turned and walked inside the building, and I followed. We were seated quickly, which I found odd, and the server seemed to linger at our table even though we had already ordered our drinks. Eventually the young man walked away, and my husband looked at me with a semi-glazed look in his eyes. I opened the envelope. When I saw the header of the papers, my heart stopped. Divorce. The word felt heavy and my lips and tongue felt numb as I spoke it. Yes. He replied with no emotion, though the question had been rhetorical. I shook my head and tucked the papers away before the young man brought my soda and his water. Anger and sadness were at war inside me. I wanted to confront him about how much he had changed since the car accident. Instead, I broke down in tears. I stood and excused myself. I didn't feel stable enough to drive home, so I called my mother, who was more than happy to come and pick me up. "It went that badly, huh?" she asked me, trying to be sympathetic. "He wants a divorce." I explained. "Oh honey. I'm so sorry," she said, reaching over to pat the back of my hand before returning her grip to the wheel. I didn't reply, simply stared out of the window until we arrived at my home. When I got inside, I placed the paperwork on the dining room table, sitting down to start reading through the packet. His reason for the divorce was irreconcilable differences, but had offered no explanation in the space provided. For a moment I wondered if he had somehow changed his sexuality after awakening from the coma. I gave myself a few days to process things, and called him last Wednesday. Once again he was cordial with me, almost as if he weren't breaking my heart. It was that night that I decided I would do something drastic. If he went out to that barn, I would go there as well, and confront him. I checked his location obsessively that night, but he stayed in town. It was Friday before he visited the barn, but true to my silent promise, I got dressed in all black clothing and drove out of town. I parked on the side of the narrow dirt road again, glancing around as I pulled the hood over my head, the chill immediately biting my ears. My breath hung in the air as I crept forward. I looked around, but again saw nobody outside the building. I could again see the flickering light. I hurried toward the barn, feeling emboldened suddenly. I was going to get my answers at the very least. I didn't care what any of the strangers said. Those thoughts died in my brain when I tried to open the door I had peeked through before. It was shut, and there was no give to it at all. That meant that someone had known about my visit after all. I could hear Terry's voice through the wall, once again leading that foreign chant. I looked around again, feeling as if I were being watched. I saw no one as I looked over by the minivan other car parked in the small lot again, but the feeling persisted. I stepped away from the door and started around toward the front of the building. I heard a scrabbling sound from the roof of the barn, which caused my head to jerk in that direction. The first thing I noticed were a pair of glowing deep purple eyes in the darkness above my head. I couldn't make out the form of the thing initially, as it kind of blended into the gloom around it. It moved, and I took it in. The thing was bipedal, but I would not call it humanoid. It was like a twisted, undulating mass of darkness except for the eyes. A cry rose from my throat before I could slam my mouth closed, and the thing on the roof reacted, leaping toward me. I started running before it landed on the ground, and didn't look back until I reached my car. It hadn't chased me. I sat behind the wheel and waited to see the thing coming at me. I didn't. I also didn't leave as I was planning to do as I sprinted down the dirt road. Instead, I turned the key and drove toward the barn, turning my headlights on, hitting the lever that turned on the brighter bulbs. I rounded the corner, but there was nothing there but the barn. I wondered if I had imagined the thing, but the fact that the area was vacant also galvanized me. I accelerated until I got closer to the barn, the palm of my hand pressing into the horn, laying on it. The prolonged beeping sound seemed to drown out everything, and when I braked, I shifted the car into park, and my foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The impromptu plan to disrupt whatever they were doing worked. The barn doors opened and there was a group of angry people illuminated by the lights on the car. One of them, the woman who had been at my apartment, began to grin. She stepped forward and raised her left arm, 2 fingers of that hand directed at my car. There was a thud on the roof and I heard a low rumbling noise above me. The sound seemed to resonate in my very core, turning my guts and spine into jelly in an instant. I slammed the car into reverse and pressed the gas again. The wheels spun for a half a second before it started moving backward. The thing on the roof hung on somehow and I started to panic. I slammed on the brakes as hard as I could. That threw the thing in front of my car, and I got a good look at it for the first time. Its flesh was as dark as I had thought, and pulsing with odd cyst-like knobs that seemed to have minds of their own. The worst part was that twisted face, no nose or ears, just a knobby mass with a split that revealed rotted-looking, sharp teeth. I screamed again, and started to reverse again. I turned my car around as the creature rushed toward me. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I rounded the corner and punched the gas pedal again, the thing with the glowing eyes gaining ground on me even as I sped up. It stopped when I reached the main road, and I breathed a sigh of relief even though I was still terrified. I drove the rest of the way home, and tried to reason through the night's events. I have spent the past 5 days or so going down internet rabbit holes, trying to figure out what the thing I saw was, but I've had no luck. Another recurring question I have is this: what happened to my husband while he was comatose, and who are these strangers he is meeting with? I don't know about going back to the barn, with that beast guarding them. I signed the divorce papers, and am going to call my soon-to-be ex-husband. Maybe I will confront him on the phone. I will update again soon.
Until next time, subscribe to stay up to date with all updates. No screamers or shocking moments, only comfort and safety. Bye.